Thanks all for taking some time out of your day to join us for the presentation. My name is Scott Dill, and I'm on the business development team here at the Real Story Group. We've got a really fun topic today, as everyone who knows about Real Story Group seems to know a little bit about our famous vendor subway map. It's one of our favorite handouts at the different conferences and events we go to, and really, since we've been keeping an eye on the content technology space for over 15 years, we wanted to put something together that would help our customers try to make sense out of this ever-changing marketplace. So after a late night ride in the tube in London and studying the station maps there, the idea for the vendor subway map was born. As the technology market continues to evolve, the vendor map does as well. So today, our company founder, Tony Byrne, will walk us through the updates that have been made for 2016 and what that means to you as a digital leader for your organization. And with that, I'd like to turn things over to Tony.
Great, thanks, Scott. Really excited to be with you all again. This is such an interesting topic, what's going on in the digital vendor landscape as they try to adapt to your ideas around digital transformation and try to help, take you into the digital future. There are many changes afoot across the landscape and changes to the map, and it's always interesting and kind of fun to talk about just what's going on. So just real quickly, we're doing this webinar today in concert with our friends and partners at CMS Wire, and you know that they host the annual DX Summit. It's a wonderful event. I encourage you to join us this year at the Radisson Blu in lovely Chicago. We're going to be talking about digital experience technology there and a little bit more about what's happening out there in the marketplace, but that's just two of a number of great sessions, so really encourage you to check it out. Last year's event was wonderful, and we're really excited about this year's DX Summit. We know that a number of you are new to Real Story Group, so just a real quick background about what we do. We're an analyst firm, but we're a different kind of analyst firm. We analyze the weaknesses and strengths of the tools and vendors and give you the tools to make good choices yourself. And for those of you who are subscribers, you know that we also can advise and mentor you on a successful technology selection. New this year is a series of innovative benchmarking services. So you may have already picked the tools that you have, but are you really getting all the value out of them that you could or should be? And we have a set of tools that help you benchmark your effectiveness against your peers. And so we cover a variety of different digital workplace and marketing technologies. And so these are lines on our tube map here that we'll get to in a minute. And the key thing is that we are 100% a buyer's advocate. That is, we don't work for vendors, we don't shill for them, we don't advise them. We're really focused just on supporting you, the buyer. And so that gives us, I would say, great freedom to tell what we think is the real story about what's going on, and not just what works well, but what are some of the problems and challenges that certainly vendors are facing and that you're facing. All right, so let's talk then about this year's subway map, and I think if there's an overarching theme, it's plus ça change, but also the rest of this, which is plus ça reste la même, which means of course the more things change, the more they stay the same. So there's quite a lot of change roiling these marketplaces, but also some persistent themes, and so we'll be trying to kind of isolate both of those. Now, here's the latest and greatest map. You can download this from our website at realstorygroup.com/vendor map. You can get a high-res PDF, JPEG, whatever version you need. But what this does is it looks at 7 key technology marketplaces and then sort of places the different vendors along the lines based on what it is that they do. So beyond that, there's a little bit of clustering. Sometimes we put some open source together or certain regional, but I wouldn't read too much into where a particular vendor is, except that, of course, you have this kind of a center with some of the larger vendors and more active players, and then a periphery with some of the more smaller or point-oriented solutions. And that's really kind of the first theme of this, is that, you know, there's definitively a city center with a lot of names that you recognize, but also a lot of change over the last, I would say, couple of years. One is HP, which used to be a major subway stop, is now effectively closed on this front, having sold the last of their assets to OpenText. And so you see OpenText very active on lines there. It's interesting because now OpenText has multiple tools on the pink line. You might say multiple stops there, but also some overlap as well. Now, the other thing is that certain big name vendors like EMC, their footprint has kind of shrunk over the years. They used to have you know, Portal and WCM offerings and have gotten a little smaller. Whereas you know, Salesforce has become a really big player on the scene, and of course Google and SAP and Adobe are all still active. What's interesting, of course, is that Microsoft, still there in the center, has always been kind of at the center of these things. A lot lighter as far as digital marketing is concerned. So you see that the purple line doesn't go through Microsoft. And what's interesting about Microsoft, of course, is that it's largely focused on SharePoint and Office 365, whereas IBM and Oracle, it's really more a suite of different tools, and certainly OpenText, most of which were done through acquisition. So Microsoft is sort of like the major platform. IBM, OpenText, Oracle, certainly Salesforce have cobbled together various tools through acquisition. But you still have this major city center with major players who obviously want to get sort of more share of your wallet. But then if you look at the broader periphery, you see a whole slew of vendors, some small, some large, who also provide these services. And this periphery is actually where a lot of the more interesting stuff is happening. As you can imagine, this is where a lot of the innovation is happening. This is where you find some important regional players, particularly some who are focused, for example, on Europe or Asia Pac. This is where you see a lot more interesting sort of cloud options coming up as well. So there's definitely a kind of a center periphery thing in this marketplace. There always has been, but some of the dynamics are changing a little bit, particularly in the last year or so. So let's talk about some of those. So the first one is center versus periphery, as we talked about. In many cases, this is kind of suite versus best of breed. So you have vendors like IBM that have whole suites of tools. Some of them integrated, usually not so well integrated. And then, of course, in the periphery, you tend to see more best of breed or point type solutions. There's often an issue of new versus older technology. It's not always that way, but you know, if you look at vendors like OpenText, their technology, their code bases tend to be older compared to some of the newer players that you see. Very often a sort of a product versus platform approach. So platform, of course, being infinitely customizable, product being a little bit more out of the box. That one isn't always center periphery, that some of the tools on the periphery are quite complex, quite extensible. In some cases, it's quite expensive and platform-like, but in general, there's kind of a product versus platform thing going on. And then this whole issue around cloud is that almost all of these tools are cloudable, but they're not all cloud native, which is interesting. And it's an important distinction, and it also gets into single tenancy versus multi-tenancy and so on and so forth. So, you know, there's definitely a lot of different choices emerging as far as how you do cloud. My colleague Teresa did a webinar on this about a month ago that you can find a recording of on our site. But what we're seeing out in the periphery is the advent of some new cloud native solutions that are really quite interesting and I think potentially quite transformative. So that part's relatively new. The more interesting thing I think that has really been pervasive for the last 15 years is this notion of real fragmentation in the marketplaces. And fragmentation is kind of analyst speaking for there are a lot of different vendors across all of these technologies. And so on the one hand, that can make it kind of confusing, and that's one of the reasons why we have this subway map in the first place. But on the other hand, it's not really a bad thing. It means there's a lot of choices, there's a lot of competition. Certainly we've seen a lot of price competition emerge, and a lot of innovation going on. The other thing is, across most of these marketplaces, there are regional differences. In other words, there are regional players who are very specialized, and with different, data harbor and data residency laws and such, that may come even into play. The other thing is, we see a lot of variation among the different models, not just with respect to, licensing, but also in terms of channel. Does the vendor sell directly, or do you have to buy through a partner? What kind of hosting services do they provide or not provide? What kind of single tenancy or multi-tenancy cloud options are there? A lot of innovation going on in sort of go-to-market models, which again is good because it gives you a lot of choices. It just requires that maybe you have to do a little bit of extra legwork and investigation, and certainly that's an area where we can help you. The other thing that we're seeing more of in the past year is what we might call boundary overlap, and so that is, a vendor who is a digital asset management vendor who might now provide some WCM services as part of their tool, or frequently you see a web content management vendor that's providing more and more digital asset management capabilities. And so that too gives you more interesting options. I think as a customer, you need to be careful though about how many pieces you want to get out of a single system, particularly if you're a larger enterprise with more specialized needs. So again, that kind of reintroduces the kind of suite versus best of breed dilemma, and I think that's becoming increasingly acute. And I would say a lot of the calls that we have, the advisory calls we have with our subscribers, are just around this very issue of what boundaries do I want to put around something like a SharePoint or something like a Drupal that I have? What do I want to ask it to do, and what do I not want to ask it to do? There's no simple answer to that. We tend to counsel people around having more boundaries rather than fewer, but you have to take that on a case-by-case basis. So that's some overarching themes. Now let's look at some of the individual lines on our subway map. So we'll start with the light blue line here, starting over on the left with Drupal, and then going through a number of open source and commercial options through the city center to OpenText, IBM, Adobe, Microsoft, Oracle. The big players all have their systems, but I would say, one of the most interesting things about the WCM marketplace, and this comes up again in Dan, is that it has tended to be not the big name vendors who have really excelled here, but that, again, a lot of the innovation is happening out at the periphery. It's a highly fragmented marketplace, and in fact, Oracle and IBM and OpenText and previously EMC have tended to sort of drift some of their attention away from this particular technology, and that's opened up a whole avenue of customers for a lot of these sort of best of breed players. Adobe is a little bit of an exception to that because, as you know, they put a lot of attention into the former CQ product, now Adobe AEM Sites, that they acquired. It is, unlike other Adobe tools, however, possibly the most complex WCM on the marketplace today. And so with complicated, you obviously need to be careful there. But again, the reality is it's a highly fragmented marketplace, and that has brought a lot of innovation and a lot of change to this marketplace as well. We're starting to see increasing sophistication even among some of the simpler tools. With some of that sophistication, we have seen also some struggles in terms of adopting and really leveraging the technology to its full extent. But you can now get advanced services like segmentation and personalization and integration with lead management and that sort of thing from even some of the simpler and less expensive tools. So there's been a real push in terms of functionality and a real diffusion of functionality, so that the value to the feature to cost ratio is definitely going up. So digital asset management, this is the kind of pink line that we have here. Also highly fragmented, also most of the interesting stuff happening not in the city center, but out at the periphery. A lot of vendors, a lot of innovation, particularly coming out of Europe to these days. We've just done a major release and upgrade to this report with all new evaluation criteria. I encourage you to check it out. A lot of interesting things happening in the digital media asset space. In fact, we now refer to it as digital and marketing asset management. And I think that's probably the biggest trend this year, is the intense new sort of marketing interest in this, and trying to take these tools, which have historically had kind of a repository and content organizational sort of mandate, to becoming more marketing oriented, to try to put these assets in motion across multiple channels. Has driven a lot of very complicated integration requirements, is pushing customers to the cloud, and so a lot of issues here around cloud native versus products that are cloudable, and so we expect to see quite a bit more innovation again over the coming year, and you can be sure we'll be watching this very closely. Campaign and lead management. This is really around outbound marketing through marketing automation and social. That's the purple line. A lot of interesting activity happening here. Vendors innovating very rapidly. New vendors entering the marketplace. We're certainly expanding the number of vendors that we cover every year, and so I expect the purple line to see a lot of construction going forward, and some new stations, and probably some acquisitions where you'll see potentially even vendors like SAP get into the act, maybe Microsoft, maybe OpenText, we'll see. So I expect this line to change when we update this in 6 months. I think one of the most kind of pervasive themes on this is, and it comes out in our own survey research, which you can find on our website, is I would say that these tools are probably the most underutilized of all the different technologies we cover. In other words, people have acquired a lot of power and capability, but we haven't necessarily been able to leverage it or really exploit it to the extent. And so this is an area in particular where I would encourage you not just to investigate some of our vendor evaluations, but to also look at some of the benchmarking here, because some early benchmarking data suggests that we've got a long way to go to really fully leverage some of the technologies that are on this purple line. Social collaboration is the red line. Again, it's a long and ever-changing space. Major players, of course, Microsoft, Google, IBM, SAP, now Salesforce with Chatter, are very big players. So since we're talking about enterprise social collaboration, you can imagine that the main enterprise players have a lot to say, and probably this is one where maybe they have a somewhat higher footprint already in the enterprise, but still a lot of really interesting players on the fringes. Kind of a rise in the mid-market of kind of a social intranet in a box, some new interesting open source options, and so a lot of activity in this space. And I think a sense that with going to the cloud and SharePoint sort of being subsumed within Office 365, that there's a bit of a vacuum here, and a lot of room for some of the specialized players, particularly those that you see on some of the lower right-hand side of the red line, that provide kind of a social layer on top of your existing enterprise systems. So the shortest line, I would say the most condensed line, is our green line, which is enterprise portals. And I think this kind of begs the question, are they still relevant? And the answer that I have, that we have after talking to you, many of you who have deployed these systems or think of deploying these, is that yes, portals still are relevant for certain use cases where you need essentially an integrated dashboard, where you have to combine using a lot of different types of integration methodologies, a number of legacy systems in a single experience. Portals are complicated technology. You don't want to over-deploy them where they shouldn't be. And certainly, I think there's a trend towards more lighter weight Java-based and .NET-based frameworks for doing regular web application development, but for really serious integration use cases, there's still a place for portals. And the issue, though, is that you probably have fewer choices than before. Again, this is sort of complex, heavyweight enterprise technology. Microsoft, of course, the big player on the .NET side, and then Liferay and IBM kind of duking it out in the Java world. This brings me to the last line, which is enterprise content management and cloud file sharing and sync. So by ECM, we mean kind of big time document and records management. Technology has been around for more than 2 decades, persistent need for it. A lot of interesting new approaches, both on the periphery in terms of some interesting things that we see around more packaged sorts of products to do very specific things like contracts management or the documentation around accounting and so forth. You have in the center around EMC and IBM OpenText. Microsoft tends to be these large customizable platforms, and platforms are useful, but they can also be expensive, and so I think that's also what's driven us towards the rise of Box and Dropbox and Simplicity and Oxygen Cloud and some of the other cloud-based file sharing systems. That there's a case to be made for really simple document-oriented processes, and they have definitely filled an important niche in that marketplace. Okay, so the issue is, okay, there's all these tools. How do I know which one is right for me? So I'm just going to wrap up here and then turn it back over to you, Scott, by just talking about the right way to decide. And I think one of the issues that comes up fairly persistently in our advisory calls with our subscribers is this whole notion of, do I align around a big vendor and then bolt some things on, or do I do all best of breed? And these are kind of two extremes, but I would say that there's a growing trend in the enterprise to kind of maybe reduce some of the footprint of our major platforms. And not that we shouldn't have them, say it's an IBM stack or an Oracle stack or SharePoint, but that we're going to maybe rely a little bit less on a single major platform and maybe get to some bigger bubbles around it. Some of our subscribers have very successfully taken a best of breed approach as well, both within the digital workplace, and increasingly now we see with respect to digital marketing a definite bias towards more of a best of breed rather than a platform or suite approach. Of course, you know that the answer always is it depends, but I'm just suggesting that we're seeing a lot more multi-vendor type architectures, both in the digital workplace and especially around digital marketing. And what this means as a digital professional, that if you are used to riding a single subway line, that you are like a DAM expert or you're a portals expert or you're an ECM expert, that you really ought to be thinking about taking some experimental trips on some other lines, that as a digital professional, you're going to have to know a little bit more about a wider set of technologies, both for your professional growth and I think just part and parcel of being able to understand how all these pieces fit together in a modern digital workplace or in a modern customer digital engagement environment. So how do you go about actually, picking these tools? This is from kind of a funny slide from a friend of ours, Martin White. You can, of course, find some mystical quadrant to tell you who the winners and losers are. We suggest a more agile-based approach around filtering and getting hands-on with the tools. I won't go into great detail here on this. You can get see some webinars on our site around the best way to select technology. But the key thing here is to really keep it real, to build test-oriented narrative journeys and organize your selection process around that. Of course, we produce research for a living, so we're big believers in injecting research into this so that you can understand who are the right vendors to target, what are their pros and cons, what are the weaknesses to look out for, and all of that. But the key thing is to take an agile, iterative approach that gets you hands-on with the technology as soon as possible. So with that, we will turn to your questions. Quite a few questions have come up, and so I'm just going to take a look at them real quickly. And Scott, if you want to just talk about next steps for a second, and then we'll turn over to the questions.
Absolutely. Thanks, Tony. And we certainly hope it was helpful to understand a little bit more about the methodology behind the vendor map and what's happening in the different marketplaces that we cover. You can get direct access to Tony and the rest of our analyst team by becoming a Real Story Group subscriber. With a subscription, you get our most up-to-date vendor evaluations, as well as market analyses, recorded webinars, and the interactive tools that Tony mentioned to help both measure your digital effectiveness and also create a custom shortlist to help determine which of these technology products makes the most sense for your particular needs. We'd encourage you to reach out to explore@realstorygroup.com, and we'd be happy to take you on a behind-the-scenes tour of the Real Story Group subway experience, the subscriber experience, and also review the subscription options that are available. And with that, it does look like there are several questions for Tony.
Yeah, and feel free to type any new ones in the box. Several of you have pointed out that LifeRay appears on the map twice, so we have our own little document versioning problem. I'm using an older version of this map. I believe in the latest one we just published, we've corrected that, so thank you. We are imperfect cartographers, I would say, and we're often shuttling these things around, and that one slipped in twice, so thank you for pointing that out, and we'll definitely get the updated version out. Now, Alexander's asking about Clone, open source vendor that used to be on the red line and is no longer. In other words, we used to categorize and evaluate Clone as a collaboration and social software product, and it does have some features around that. I think the issue with Alexander was that when we, went out to our own subscriber base of mostly large enterprises, we found that they typically were not using Clone for that particular purpose, that it was being used primarily for WCM and portal-like use cases. Doesn't mean that you can't use Clone for social collaboration if you already have it, and certainly we could say that about a lot of these tools. That again, these boundaries that we create, these subway lines, are always going to be a little bit artificial, and there's things that you can do with some of these tools that expand beyond the actual line that they're on. You might think of it that the train can maybe run on different tracks, but we tend to think that particularly as your needs become more sophisticated as a customer, that you really want to focus on what is this tool really good at, what does it want to do naturally, and that you need to be careful about more omnibus sort of tools. Neil's asking a really interesting question. Is there a natural migration from the periphery into the center as companies become more sophisticated? You see people moving out to the suburbs to fill gaps. I think, from a customer perspective, it depends a lot on how large your enterprise is. I think that I think people tend to start in the city and kind of base on a platform and then start moving out and supplementing that platform. Again, we've had customers, including major enterprises, that have gone really best of breed, or that are, in some cases, even have competing products in-house. So there's a lot of different ways to do this. What I find is more that there's poaching going on, where the Oracles and IBMs and OpenText of this world will purchase interesting technology from the periphery and bring it back into their center. So there's definitely some acquisition going on. Andy's asking, why is Box included and Dropbox excluded? So we do keep an eye on Dropbox. We just find that among our subscribers, it's not nearly as prevalent as Box, and that Box has really made a play for the enterprise market. Dropbox maybe less so, and so our customers are telling us, hey, spend more time telling us about the pros and cons of Box, and we're less interested in Dropbox. Is there any significance in the order? Tim is asking, is there any significance in the order the vendors appear on the line? And Tim, the answer is generally no. Sometimes we see if we can group some together, but the demands of cartography have forced our hand in many ways about what fits where, and so there isn't necessarily. HubSpot is definitely on the purple line, Leslie. Mitch is asking if the slides are available. And yes, Mitch, you will get a copy of the slides, and if your firm is a subscriber, then you will also get access to this whole webinar on demand. Hi, Leslie, how are you? You have some thoughts on managing content in Salesforce and where Acquia is headed. Managing content in Salesforce has historically been quite fraught, and there's still issues around it, and it has to do with the fact that it has various different places to put documents, and the way that it's been acquiring tools over the years, it's got kind of various different document subsystems, and it's not particularly great at at storing unstructured content as well. And so we tend to encourage people to not use Salesforce as a document store and instead to connect into other content stores. Where Acquia is headed, Acquia is the major commercial arm behind Drupal, but there are many other Drupal enterprises as well. But Acquia is probably the largest and most well-known, and where they are headed is to provide proprietary services in a software as a service model in the cloud. So it's a very interesting approach. They're driving the Drupal roadmap, which I think in general is a good thing. I think they've driven it to some good places in Drupal 8, along with the rest of the community. You just need to understand what Acquia's game is here, that they're not necessarily taking capabilities and putting them into modules that other people can use in their Drupal environments. They're providing a lot of services that you could only use in the Acquia cloud. Allison's asking about Facebook at Work, and we're in the process of adding them to the red line. So that is a station under construction, Allison. Tyler's asking a really good question. Do you recommend the same research, shortlist, RFP, bake-off for each type of marketing technology, or one project to identify each of the tools and ecosystem at once? I would use this for each individual type of technology. As I said, some selections are going to be simpler and faster than others, and a lot of it depends on how important is this technology to you. If it's really core to your mission and it's really critical for you, then obviously you want to spend more time and be more involved. Leslie's asking, do you evaluate for global systems? And the answer is yes. Across nearly all of our research, we look at issues of localization, internationalization, support for character sets and all sorts of things, and more definitively, what are some of the key issues that come up, particularly around workflow in a global environment? And this is an issue. It's been an issue, particularly in social collaboration, where some of the tools that came out of North America were not necessarily very good in a multilingual environment. It's still an issue in the WCN space, and so it's definitely one of the criteria that we apply across nearly all of the technologies. So we've gone about 5 minutes over, a very exciting topic. I could go on and tell you more, but at this point, out of respect for your time, we're going to wrap up. But I just wanted to thank you for participating with us today, and look forward to keeping up the conversation. If you have anything else to add, please feel free to get in touch with us. But for now, this is Tony Byrne from Real Story Group signing off and thanking you once again. Bye now.